The Journey of Remembering. In a bustling school nestled in a lively neighborhood, young Leo, 14 years old, sat attentively in his classroom. It was a special day. The teacher, Mrs. Anderson, was going to teach the class about International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. Today, children, she began, we're going to learn about a very important part of history. It's a story of struggle, bravery, and freedom. Mrs. Anderson paused, looking at the eager faces before her. The transatlantic slave trade began in the 16th century, she explained, and it lasted for over 400 years. Millions of African people were taken from their homes and forced onto ships bound for the Americas. These ships were overcrowded and conditions were horrendous. Many did not survive the journey. Mrs. Anderson continued, once in the Americas, the enslaved people were sold to work on plantations, in mines, and in households. They were treated as property and subjected to brutal working conditions and punishments. Despite the inhumanity they faced, they resisted in many ways. Some ran away, some rebelled, and others found ways to preserve their culture and maintain their dignity. Mrs. Anderson walked to the world map hanging on the wall. This triangle, she pointed out, shows the route known as the triangular trade. Ships would leave Europe loaded with goods, sail to Africa, where they would trade these goods for captured people, and then transport the enslaved Africans to the Americas. The ships would then return to Europe with goods produced by slave labor, such as sugar, cotton, and tobacco. All right, everyone, gather around, Mrs. Anderson said with a twinkle in her eye. I have a special assignment for you. Tomorrow, each of you will become a time traveler and storyteller, unveiling the secrets behind the abolition of the slave trade. On their walk home, Leo eagerly recounted his day's lesson to his father, Mr. Harris. Dad, did you know there was something called the slave trade? Mrs. Anderson told us about it today. It was terrible. Mr. Harris nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. Yes, Leo, it's a very important part of history. And it's crucial that we remember it so we can understand the importance of freedom and equality. Leo's curiosity was piqued. Do we know anyone who has a personal connection to this history? His father smiled. Actually, we do. How about we visit my old friend, Mr. Johnson? His ancestors were directly impacted by the slave trade. That weekend, Leo and his father visited Mr. Johnson, an elderly black man with a kind face and warm eyes. He welcomed them into his cozy home, filled with photographs and mementos of the past. Hello, Leo, Mr. Johnson greeted him warmly. Your father tells me you've been learning about the slave trade, focusing on the factors which caused its abolition. Leo nodded enthusiastically. Yes, sir. I'd love to hear more about it from you. Mr. Johnson said, my great-great-grandparents were brought to this country as slaves. They endured unimaginable hardships, but also showed incredible strength and resilience. Leo leaned forward, eager to hear more. Mr. Johnson continued, one of the most significant factors that led to the abolition of the slave trade was the relentless efforts of abolitionists. People like William Wilberforce in Britain and Frederick Douglass in America dedicated their lives to fighting for the end of slavery. They wrote powerful speeches, published influential books, and organized movements that gradually turned public opinion against the inhuman practice of slavery. Mr. Johnson's voice grew firmer as he spoke. Another crucial factor was the role of enslaved people themselves. They resisted their oppression in countless ways, from subtle acts of defiance to full-scale rebellions. The Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture, was a landmark event. Enslaved Africans in Haiti rose up against their French oppressors, eventually establishing the first independent Black republic. Their victory was a powerful statement against the institution of slavery and inspired others to fight for their freedom. The Industrial Revolution also played a role, Mr. Johnson explained. As industries grew and evolved, the economic landscape began to change. The reliance on slave labor became less profitable compared to wage labor in the factories. The economic argument for maintaining slavery weakened, and many business owners and politicians started to see abolition as a viable and even necessary option for continued economic growth and stability. Mr. Johnson paused to let his words sink in. Public opinion was further swayed by the gruesome realities of the slave trade being exposed to a wider audience. Former slaves, such as Olaudah Equiano, published their harrowing autobiographies, detailing the brutality they endured. These first-hand accounts, along with vivid illustrations and reports of the horrors of the Middle Passage, shocked the conscience of the general public and galvanized support for abolition. Mr. Johnson concluded, the legal and political efforts cannot be overlooked. Lawsuits brought by, and on behalf of enslaved individuals, challenged the legality of slavery in courtrooms. The landmark Somerset v. Stewart case in 1772 in Britain, for example, declared that slavery was unsupported by common law in England. Political leaders like Wilberforce worked tirelessly within the government to pass legislation, such as the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, in 1807. This act made it illegal to transport enslaved people within the British Empire, setting a precedent for other nations to follow. Leo understood that it wasn't just one singular event or person that led to the end of this cruel practice, but a combination of passionate individuals, economic shifts, powerful stories, and legal battles. It was a collective effort, driven by the unyielding spirit of those who fought for justice and freedom. Leo felt a deep sense of respect and admiration for all those who had contributed to this monumental change in history. Leo's heart swelled with admiration. "Thank you for sharing these stories with me, Mr. Johnson. I feel like I understand so much more now." On the walk back home, Leo felt a deep sense of connection to the past. "Dad," he said, looking up at his father, "I'll never forget what I learned today. I want to make sure everyone knows how important it is to remember this history." Mr. Harris replied, "That's a wonderful promise, Leo. By remembering and sharing these stories, we honor those who came before us and help build a better future." The next day, when Mrs. Anderson asked for the task he gave the students, Leo was the first to raise his hand and share the story with the teacher and rest of the class.